So for this video, we will review Chapter 6 on proteins. So here we're going to focus on outlining the basic structure of a protein. We'll talk about the digestion, absorption, and metabolism of protein. We'll talk about their primary functions in the body, how to calculate an individual's protein needs based on the RDA. We'll talk about individuals with a negative or positive protein balance. We'll talk about impacts of high or low intakes of protein, and we'll talk a bit about complementary proteins and a vegetarian diet. So this slide goes over the basic structure of amino acid. We see that they have a central carbon and 4 side groups, which includes an amino group, a carboxylic acid, a hydrogen, and an R group, which varies based on the amino acid. We have 20 amino acids, 9 being essential and 11 non-essential, and they will all vary based on their R group. You'll see here that glycine's R group is a hydrogen, whereas alanine's R group is a CH3. They will all have different R groups. We see here the 20 essential amino acids with 9 being essential: histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. 3 are the branched chain amino acids, including isoleucine, leucine, and valine. Essential amino acids are required to be consumed in the diet because we cannot make them in the body, and they are required for essential body functions. So you can go over these questions to test your knowledge on the basic structure of an amino acid and differences between the essential and non-essential amino acids. Here we see the formation of a peptide bond, which is the joining of 2 amino acids. You can see here the bond is formed between the carboxylic acid group and the amino group, and you can see them joined together from 2 amino acids into a dipeptide. We see you can form dipeptides, tripeptides, oligo and polypeptides, with proteins consisting of polypeptides and much longer chains consisting of 50 to up to 2,000 amino acids. Here is an overview of the process of protein synthesis. So we see here that the DNA provides the information needed to produce proteins. The process involves something called transcription, which is the copying of a segment of the DNA needed to make a protein, and this segment is called the mRNA. The mRNA leaves the nucleus and goes to a ribosome within the cell. Amino acids are carried to a ribosome by tRNA, where translation of the mRNA occurs to synthesize a protein. So that's the process of protein synthesis, which is initiated by the code existing within the DNA. The protein is then folded into what's called a quaternary structure, which that structure is affected by the amino acid sequence. The shape of the protein in turn affects its function in the body. So each protein will have this 3-dimensional quaternary structure. The amino acids within the structure affect its shape, and the shape affects its function. Sickle cell anemia is an example of a condition affected by protein structure. It's an illness caused by malformation of the hemoglobin component of red blood cells. This malformation is due to a mutation in the genetic code for hemoglobin, which leads to the amino acid glutamic acid being replaced with the amino acid valine. So glutamic acid should be there, but valine is there in its place. And this replacement changes the hemoglobin protein structure, and then therefore the red blood cell structure, from a circular shape to a crescent shape. So the structure of the red blood cell is altered as a result of this change in the amino acids. The change in the shape of the red blood cell affects its ability to transport oxygen throughout the blood. So you see just one change, this small change in the amino acids within the protein affects its structure. The change in shape from a circular shape to a crescent shape, which then in turn affects its function. The denaturing of protein occurs when it changes from its three-dimensional structure to a linear amino acid chain. So we talked about that three-dimensional structure. It also is called its quaternary structure, and the process of denaturing protein takes it from that three-dimensional structure to a linear chain. That can occur through various conditions with heat, enzymes in an acidic environment, or with agitation, such as with cooking. When you whip up an egg white mixture, that would be agitating, and that would affect the structure and lead to the denaturing. The denaturing of protein occurs in the acidic environment of the stomach and helps with the process of digestion. So this denaturing process occurs during digestion, and this actually helps with the process of digestion because it increases the exposure of the peptide bonds to the enzymes needed to digest that protein and break the peptide bonds to then take the longer chain of the linear chain consisting of 50 to up to 2,000 amino acids to smaller peptides, and then eventually all the way down to individual amino acids. Keep in mind that the denaturing of protein does not alter its nutritional quality. So just keep in mind that that doesn't affect the nutritional quality of the protein. We absorb and utilize individual amino acids, not whole proteins. So we break down the proteins to the amino acids, and those amino acids that we absorb are then used to form the proteins that we need in the body for key processes. So you can go over these questions regarding the DNA, the role of DNA in the process of protein synthesis, the steps, the amino acid order and how that affects a protein and its function, and the denaturing of protein. You can go over these questions to test and review your understanding of this material. So this slide talks about the trends in protein consumption in the US. So you can see the top 5 sources of protein in the US diet are all animal-based protein sources versus plant-based, and we'll talk about food sources of protein, but the top 5 being beef, poultry, milk, white bread, and cheese. Meat and poultry intake, however, has declined in recent years. You can see the 5 major food groups and the amount of protein contained per serving. So if you look through the food groups, you can see what would be higher or lower sources of protein. So fruit would be the lowest, with dairy and protein foods being the highest source of protein. We do still get a somewhat substantial amount of protein from grains and vegetables as well. So the quality of protein in foods is rated, and you can determine the quality of foods based on the amount of the essential amino acids in a given food and also its bioavailability. So foods can be evaluated for their protein quality, and foods containing all of the essential amino acids are called complete protein foods. So foods, again, containing all essential amino acids are complete protein foods, and these would be animal sources of protein, including eggs, dairy, poultry, fish, and meat. So anywhere where we're getting the protein from animal sources. Most plant-based sources of protein are called incomplete protein foods, meaning that they are lacking one or more of the essential amino acids. Since most plant-based sources of protein do not contain all of the essential amino acids, it's recommended that we get a variety of types of plant-based foods to ensure adequate intake of the essential amino acids. Examples of foods that when paired together, you can see that here, examples of foods that when paired together contain all of the essential amino acids include rice and beans. So rice will contain some of the essential amino acids that beans do not contain, and vice versa. Nuts or nut butter with bread, such as peanut butter with bread or almond butter with bread. Nuts would contain some of the essential amino acids not contained in bread, and vice versa. Also, vegetables and legumes would also be an example. Even though plant-based sources of protein are not considered complete, they don't contain all the essential amino acids. When paired together, you will get the essential amino acids throughout the day. So it is definitely recommended to consume plant-based sources of proteins because they are very nutrient dense, containing many essential vitamins and minerals. They also contain phytochemicals. Examples of foods with higher amounts of protein, you can see here, per serving for a half cup of beans would contain 7 grams of protein. So beans would be a higher protein plant-based protein source. Food allergens or food allergies are caused by the body's misinterpretation of a food protein for a harmful substance. So the body will see a food protein or a protein from our food and interpret it as harmful. Therefore, it is an allergy to the protein in a food. 8 foods account for 90% of food-related allergies, and these foods include nuts or peanuts and tree nuts, dairy foods, soy, wheat, eggs, fish, and shellfish. So you can review these questions to test your understanding of the material on the previous slides. Okay, so we will now go over the digestion and absorption of protein. It's always interesting to compare and contrast the process of digestion and absorption of protein as compared to lipid and carbohydrates. For protein, the process of digestion actually occurs in the stomach. With the other macronutrients, it actually begins in the mouth. But for protein, it begins in the stomach. When we think of and chew food, that process causes a release of a hormone called gastrin in the stomach. So gastrin is secreted within the stomach, and that promotes the release of hydrochloric acid. And that hydrochloric acid will then denature our proteins. So the hydrochloric acid denatures the food proteins, it kills pathogens, and activates an enzyme called pepsin. Pepsin is present within the stomach, so it's secreted within the stomach, and pepsin is the first enzyme that promotes the digestion of protein in the stomach, the breaking of the peptide bonds. So from there, from the stomach, the partially digested proteins move into the small intestine, and during that process, we have the release of the hormone cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin then causes the pancreas to release further enzymes that further digest the amino acid chains to the dipeptides and individual amino acids. And one of the key enzymes involved in the digestion of protein in the small intestine is called trypsin. We then have the absorption of amino acids in the small intestine. Those amino acids will then go into the blood circulation through the portal vein. It will be transported to the liver. Okay, so this is a little bit more on the absorption. So dipeptides and individual amino acids are absorbed into the intestinal cell. From there, it goes into the bloodstream through the hepatic portal vein and then goes for further processing in the liver. The fates of the amino acids, there are several fates They are either used for protein synthesis, they can be metabolized to produce ATP for fuel, for energy for our cells, or they can be stored. Okay, so you can review these questions covering the process of protein digestion and absorption. Next, we will go over the functions of proteins. So there are many important functions of proteins that we will review. Proteins are used for structural purposes. They are the building blocks of many of our body tissues. They help to form the structure collagen, which is the protein in our skin and our ligaments, our tendons and bones. So it's the structural protein. We also have it as a protein for our muscle cells. Regulatory functions for fluid balance, acid-base balance. They help in the formation of hormones and enzymes. It's involved in immune system function. They also will contribute to satiety. We can use a smaller percentage of our proteins for energy. Carbohydrate and lipids are primarily used for energy to produce ATP. A smaller percentage of protein will be used for ATP production. You can see here the process of proteins involved in the regulation of fluid balance. So with normal tissue, with a normal protein status, you'll see just a normal fluid level of our skin. However, with a protein deficiency, that actually will lead to swollen tissue called edema. So you can see here the involvement of proteins contributing to acid-base balance. It's very important that the pH of our blood be maintained within a tight range. We don't want our pH to be too acidic or too low or too basic or too high. So the proteins in cell membranes will pump ions in and out of cells to help with the maintenance of our blood pH. Also, we have amino acids that act as buffers, which will largely resist changes in pH in a given solution. So there's two ways that proteins help with the acid-base balance. You can see this wonderful summary of the functions of protein. It's called the protein concept map. There are the list of functions and more details on each function. So we see the structural functions, muscle fibers, connective tissue, and also globular proteins, helps with fluid balance in the blood. We see it contributes to acid-base balance by pumping ions or acting as buffers. It helps to form enzymes and hormones, contributes to immune system function by helping with the formation of antibodies, and also helps with providing energy and satiety. Here's another diagram outlining the metabolism of amino acids. So essentially what's happening when we consume amino acids, what are the fates of amino acids, and then how are they excreted. So we can see that our amino acid pool comes from the amino acids that we consume from our diet and the amino acids that are broken down from cell, or the amino acids that become available from cell breakdown. So those are the amino acids within this amino acid pool. And then we see 5 fates essentially of the amino acids. So they can be used for synthesizing the body proteins that we talked about, needed for forming enzymes, hormones, contractile proteins, antibodies, structural components, etc. So protein synthesis, we can see that it can be used to synthesize non-protein nitrogen-containing compounds, such as the compound, it's a neurotransmitter called serotonin. We can see that the amino acid pool can be used to form fat, and this would be in an energy surplus. the remaining amino acids or available amino acids can be used and stored as fat. Amino acids can be used to form glucose, and this would be in more of a starvation or fasting state. So when we have low blood glucose and we don't have any other sources of producing glucose, amino acids can be used to form glucose through the process of gluconeogenesis. Also, amino acids can be used to produce ATP, and so this would be through the breakdown or catabolism of amino acids to their carbon skeleton, and this would yield an average of 4 calories per gram. With the further breakdown of amino acids, the waste product of amino acid catabolism is called ammonia, and that is processed in the liver through the urea cycle, and the urea is then excreted in the kidney. So this is a basic summary of the amino acid metabolism. So you can review these questions to test your understanding of the material on section 6.5. Okay, so we'll now talk about protein balance. There are populations or life stages involved in what's called a positive protein balance, a protein equilibrium state, or a negative protein balance. Positive protein balance is associated with periods of growth, so not just periods where you're building muscle, but you're growing and building overall tissue, not just muscle. So in growth stages in infancy and childhood, also during pregnancy, also in recovery stages after illness or injury where there is regrowth or rebuilding, also with athletic training, with muscle building. That is another stage where there's a positive protein balance, but there needs to be adequate hormones and energy and stimulus involved if a positive protein balance is going to be in place. Protein equilibrium is where you see healthy adults where they're kind of just maintaining their status, they're meeting their nutrient needs, there is no growth or loss that's occurring. So intake will meet excretion. With the positive protein balance, excretion or protein intake is higher than excretion, promoting growth. And then negative protein balance is when protein excretion outweighs protein intake and we have loss of tissue. So tissue loss is occurring. We can see that this is in situations of inadequate protein intake, such as with fasting conditions, inadequate calorie intake, also with certain medical conditions, with fevers, burns, or serious infections, or in conditions of increased protein loss, such as with kidney disease. We can see our protein requirements. Our recommended dietary allowance for adults is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So to identify or calculate an individual's protein need, you'll need to know their kilograms in body weight. Athletes, however, may be required to consume up to 1.7 grams per kilogram. The acceptable macronutrient distribution range is between 10% to 35% of total calories. Most individuals in the US eat above the RDA for protein, so they eat above or well above the 0.8 gram per kilogram RDA. It is interesting and important to note that excess protein intake cannot be stored as protein, and it would be converted to other substrates in the body. So you can see an example of the calculation of an individual's protein needs. So we said that you need to determine an individual's weight in kilograms. So first you would take someone's weight in pounds, convert it to kilograms, and you would do that by dividing the weight in pounds by 2.2. So 154-pound male, their weight in kilograms would be 70. And then to calculate their RDA for protein, you would multiply 70 kilograms of weight by 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram, and that would equate to 56 grams of protein would be this individual's daily protein needs. For a woman weighing 125 pounds, you would divide their weight by 2.2 and see that their weight in kilograms would be 57. 57 kilograms times 0.8 would be 46 grams of protein. So 56 and 46 for the two examples. You can see, and if you've ever calculated your own protein intake or others, most individuals in the US consume above their RDA for protein. We see here the protein intake recommendations from the most recent dietary guidelines would recommend an increase in variety of protein foods, so replacing meat, poultry, or eggs with plant-based sources such as legumes, nuts, or seeds, recommending more nutrient-dense choices, especially leaner choices of protein, again, leaner cuts of meat, but also the plant-based protein sources, also fish would be leaner and more nutrient-dense choices. And also some populations may need to reduce intakes of protein. These populations may be more likely to have excessive intakes of protein, so teenage boys and adult men. So you can review that material with these questions regarding the RDA for protein and related recommendations. So there are potentially harmful aspects of a high protein diet, and we saw that we want to vary our sources of protein to more nutrient dense sources and also more plant-based sources, and having protein intake that is well beyond the RDA may be harmful. Diets high in protein may contain low amounts of fiber, vitamins, and phytochemicals. High amounts of animal sources of protein would be high in saturated fat and in cholesterol. Processed red meat is linked to colon cancer, so higher intakes linked to cancer. There is an increased burden on the kidney to excrete protein waste. It may increase calcium losses in the urine or increase urine production and risk for dehydration. So you can go over the risks of eating a high protein, the potential risks of eating a high protein diet.